And hello, everyone again, and welcome to this evening's Australian Peace and Security Forum webinar on water, essential for life and our security. To begin, I just want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the lands where I'm joining from for today's webinar, and also extend that acknowledgement of traditional owners throughout Australia and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Feel free to put in the chat where you're joining from as well. In the context of today's webinar theme, which is all about water, I think it's really important to reflect on what we can learn from Indigenous knowledge and culture, in particular as custodians of land and waters for thousands of years. We have to remember the history and significance of the connection to water in this country. And Australia as well, being one of the driest continents and long affected by things like droughts and floods. Water is crucial for agriculture and consequently food supply and more broadly life across this country. The Australian Peace and Security Forum has been established to really take a comprehensive view of security and to understand what are the risks more broadly to our security generally and as Australians, and then how we can go about addressing them. So water security is obviously an essential dimension, especially as we see climate disruption becoming more and more prevalent. It's even more crucial that we are prepared and think more about our water and what we need to do to keep it safe and ourselves secure. So today we have three speakers who are going to provide us with different aspects on the topic, followed by Q&A. So we're going to get straight into it, and I'll introduce our first speaker, although I hadn't spotted. Oh yes, Quentin is there. Great. So our first speaker is, sorry, just give me one moment. Professor Quentin Grafton, who's going to be speaking on truths and post-truths of Australian water. Quentin is going to briefly describe the 4 great Ds of Australian water, so dispossession, delusion, diversions, and degradation, and then discuss the post-truths and reality about how Australian water is managed. Quentin Grafton is Professor at ANU and Honorary Professor, also Australian Laureate Fellow and Chairholder, and a UNESCO Chair in Water Economics, and convener of Water Justice Hub, and Executive Editor of Global Water Forum. So with that, I'll hand over to Quentin.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for being able to talk about water. I also want to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to them as traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So I've just completed a book that was published in October called Retelling Australia's Water Story. And as Matilda pointed out to us, there are several Ds in relation to Australian water. One of them is dispossession, or the Great Dispossession, which was the theft of the land, country, and including the water from the First Peoples, beginning in 1788 when the first fleet arrived. That went on in the 19th century and is still going on right now in 2024. And I would highlight in the Northern Territory, where groundwater licenses have been going out free, worth millions of dollars against the wishes of the traditional owners of the land in which they are getting the groundwater. So that's happening right now. The other issue is around diversions. So diversions is the extractions of water, particularly surface water, but also groundwater. And we see that most plainly in the Murray-Darling Basin. Too much water is being extracted, despite having a basin plan that began in 2012, despite having a Water Act that got underway in 2007, despite a promise of $13 billion and $8 billion already spent. That's $8,000 million in terms of trying to deal with this issue. A paper that just came out yesterday, led by Matt Colliff, includes myself and 10 other researchers, highlights that the state of the Murray-Darling Basin is unacceptable. doesn't meet what was promised in 2012, and certainly is far, far less than what is needed, despite the claims otherwise by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and numerous others over the last decade or so. And then the last but not least is around that issue of diversions is the degradation, a whole sort of ecological and also social, cultural losses associated with that. So the big Ds are what the book highlights and obviously talks about a pathway forward. So I've already highlighted to some extent what these post-truths are, and I'll go through, there's 5 of them that I want to highlight, and it came out in a conversation piece on the 10th of October. And so let's just go through the 5, and there's more post-truths than that in the water space in Australia and also globally, but they're certainly sufficient to give a sense of what's wrong and what we need to do. So the first one is that water buybacks harm irrigation communities or harm rural communities. There's actually very little evidence to support that, and indeed the paper I highlighted by Colliff et al. That came out in Marine and Freshwater Science yesterday goes through and talks about cash flow measures that have tripled in the last few years. We've got agricultural land values that have been increasing at 26% per year. It talks about the increase in the gross value of irrigation agriculture production in terms of water doubling. So there's really no evidence. That's not to say that there are individual irrigators are hurting for a number of reasons, but it's not because of buybacks to increase stream flows in the Murray-Darling Basin. That's certainly not the reason. I can go into a lot more detail about that, but that's the first post-truth. So it's an opinion, not based on evidence, and it's widely discussed. Second one is that increasing irrigation efficiency. That's basically how much water actually gets transpired by crops relative to the amount that's diverted. That's going to save water, and increase stream flows. No evidence of that. In fact, there's a huge evidence to support the reverse, simply because as you increase irrigation efficiency, you actually typically reduce the flows of water that would normally return back to aquifers and to streams. So in fact, you are going to reduce the stream flows in general, not always, but in general. Lots of documentation, evidence from around the world, including Australia, to support that. Again, another myth or post-truth that is holding us back in water reform. Third one is that, and I think it's fairly clear from what I've already told you in terms of the dispossession, diversions, and degradation, that Australia, despite the claims, is not the world's best in terms of water management. There are some positives. I'm not trying to knock everything down. There are positives, but certainly the idea that we are doing a good job needs to be refuted. And here's not me, but this is from the New South Wales chief scientist and engineer in relation to the fish deaths, the massive fish deaths that occurred in early 2023, not during a drought, I may add, not during a drought. These are his words: mass fish deaths are symptomatic of degradation in the broader river ecosystem over many years, ... A failure in policy implementation is the root cause. That's the New South Wales chief scientist and an engineer. So that's his view. There's decades of research to support that we're not doing what we need to do. Fourth, post-truth or myth, if you want to call it that, is all Australians have access to good quality drinking water. Well, that's actually not true, okay, in Sydney, Canberra, Perth, etc. Yes, it is in our big cities, 24/7. We do have good quality water, but there are many rural and most remote communities do not have access to good quality drinking water. That's been a problem we've known about for decades. It still hasn't been resolved, and it's a problem that we must and absolutely must fix. It contravenes the human right that we've signed up to and the human right to basic needs for water, and it contravenes all our ethics in terms of what we should be doing as one of the world's wealthiest countries. And last is this myth that always keeps on coming back, keeps on giving, that dams can drought-proof Australia. Now, dams are and have been useful in terms of dealing with interannual and even within annual rainfall variability. But pretty much all the dams that could be built have been built in southern Australia. There are plans afoot to build in northern Australia. But the point is, they haven't drought-proofed Australia. We continue to get droughts, and we continue to over-extract, and we continue not to have enough water for all sorts of purposes, cultural, social, as well as the production of food and fiber. So all 5 myths, or post-truths, whatever you call them, they need to be knocked on the head, demolished. We need to thus start with the facts and the evidence and develop a pathway to a sustainable future for our water, for our people, and everybody, and our non-human cousins here in this wonderful place, Australia. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Quentin. I think that was a great approach to point out those myths, and in doing so really give us an overview of some of the real challenges and realities that we have in Australia currently in terms of addressing different aspects of the security of our water. I'm going to now introduce our second speaker, which is Emeritus Professor Ian Lowe. So he's going to speak to water. Sorry, actually, my apologies. I've jumped us ahead. Speaking second is going to be Melita Grant. I'm talking to promoting peace through inclusive, climate resilient water security and sanitation. So Melita will discuss why and how Australia should support peace and security in our region through water diplomacy and investing in inclusive, climate resilient water security, sanitation and hygiene programs in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. Melita specialises in water, sanitation and hygiene, WASH, and integrated water resource management, IWRM, in international development, with a focus on inclusion and evidence-based policy and practice. Melita has worked for 23 years in government, university and civil society sectors with all roles related to water. And now we're going to hear from her.
Thank you very much. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose lands I'm on at the moment in beautiful Coogee in New South Wales, Sydney. Thank you very much for that overview, Quentin. That was an excellent overview of what we've done wrong, and absolutely those myths persist to this day. And some of the things I'm going to talk about are around how we not transporting our amazing, know-how to the rest of the world, but acting in a partnership way, a two-way learning way, how we can help build peace and security in our region, building on the water knowledge that we have, our experience, but also being very humble and listening to our partners and supporting them to develop their own futures. So I'm going to, first of all, just move the slide and give a little bit of a context to the dire situation. Sorry, this is still bad news, but we do get to some good news in a minute, everyone. The context in our region around water and sanitation, this is from the Sustainable Development Goals progress report from this year. And it shows that you can see on the right-hand side, there's a number of elements within SDG 6, which is the water and sanitation goal. And from these particular targets within the goal, we're seeing that the Asia and the Pacific are nowhere near meeting that target as per current trajectories. So in terms of the amount of money that's going towards water and sanitation, ODA, Official Development Assistance, that is falling well short of the target. And then you can also see, second from the bottom, safely managed drinking water services. We've not actually progressed much since 2015 for that particular criteria, and that's because safely managed is setting a very high bar, similar to what Quentin talked about in terms of our major cities. So having water available at all times that is not going to make you sick. A pretty acceptable bar in our part of the world, but it is not being achieved in our region. So this really does challenge a lot of people's health. They're having a lot of health impacts, not only diarrheal diseases, but also stunting in particular. So children not having the opportunity for their brains to grow as a result of poor water and sanitation in our region. And there's a huge number of gender equality inclusion aspects related to this as well. So bad news, but what can we do as Australians, as people working who want to work in a peaceful way with our partners in the region? Well, the water and sanitation, or the water resource management system, is quite complex. So there's a lot of different actors and agencies. We know that there's water and wastewater utilities. We've got politics and government agencies and private sector organisations. We've also got these elements here, which are what we call within the civic space. So WASH committees and NGOs, rights holder organisations, civil society organisations, research institutes. And I'm going to give some examples of the work that we do with research partnerships with those sorts of organisations, but also some water and wastewater utilities in our region. So what's the civic space, and why have I chosen to talk about this in terms of your focus, which is peace and security? Well, as you know, the civic space, your very important parts of the civic space, is the environment that enables people and groups or actors to participate meaningfully in the political, economic, and social cultural life of their societies. And the United Nations has created this report which talks about why it's important to have an open civic space. So they talk about the right to participate and speaking up for those, security for those who do speak up, freedom of expression and assembly. So these are core ingredients of an open civic space. And the result of that is that a greater variety of voices can be heard and are part of making decisions. You can get feedback loops. There's more buy-in and better policy and practice responses. And you also can build more sustainable peace. So there's a deeper foundation for peace and better development outcomes and more resilient societies. So this is all evidenced, but this guideline from the UN is really calling on UN agencies to see civil society and civic space as core key actors in creating peace and security globally. And so we're interested in working with some of those civil society actors who are delivering water and sanitation services, because the governments are not, to support them to be more effective and to use evidence in the way in which they deliver their services. Some of the organisations in that civic space we work with are women's organisations, peace-building organisations, environmental organisations, organisations for people with disabilities, sexual gender minority organisations, human rights organisations. And the ones that we work with very closely are water and sanitation organisations, those that are delivering water services, but connecting through to a lot of these types of organisations. Australia is noticing that the civic space is shrinking in our region, which is a security concern and a concern for stability. They've just launched a $35 million non-government organisation fund in support of the international development policy, which really does highlight the role of civil society organisations. And this Lowe article talks about that commitment, but also the way in which that civic space in the region is shrinking and how that is of concern to stability and peace in our region. So by actively supporting those types of organisations I just talked about, we will be contributing to greater peace and security in our region. And this is just a quote from the policy, which says, civil society organisations bring strong relationships, networks and knowledge that can deliver development impact. So it's great this has been recognised in the 2023 development policy. So in terms of outside of Australia, we work with those organisations I mentioned, who are all advocating for their rights and for their essential needs to be met, and for education of girls and women, and for water and sanitation to be provided and sustained. So by working directly with them, we're not imposing our Australian views on feminism or human rights, they're the ones in their countries who are advocating for peace and for positive social change. So by working with and through them and supporting their objectives, we are supporting what's now called locally led development. And here's an example of a partnership that I'm involved in with Indonesia. So as we know, Indonesia's our closest neighbor in terms of a very big global power as well, and a very large country. We used to have a big agenda to support the relationship between Australia and Indonesia. And I myself learned Indonesian in high school, and kids these days are not doing that. So there has been a break in that relationship in recent decades. But through programs like this, we are supporting what's called people-to-people connections and building water capabilities in Australia and in Indonesia, but really meeting people where they're at in terms of their interests and expertise and their needs for a program like this. So this is a twinning between Taswater and Girimanang, which is a water utility in Indonesia. And we've also partnered with the Australian Water Association and PAPAMSI, which is the Indonesian Water Association. And by bringing these organizations together to talk about, what do you want to learn? What do you want to find out about? How can we support you? And it's very much two-way, because I've done the monitoring evaluation for this program, and the benefits from both the Indonesian and the Australian side is really quite phenomenal. And it really is a way that tangibly can build a greater water literacy in terms of our diplomacy and our engagement with our region, definitely in terms of technical support from both Indonesian and Australian sides. But we're also seeing a lot of deep relationships and connections being formed and lifelong friendships, etc. So that's one example of a partnership that I'm involved in. And another one is in Cambodia, which is a research and civil society partnership with an NGO that's delivering water and sanitation systems to rural communities, but doing it through the local government. So they're helping the local government identify who the poorest of the poor are in the community and supporting them to build their toilets and be connected to the piped water system or have a rainwater tank or different types of systems. And this is all happening through the engagement of the local Cambodian NGO, but also with our research piece connected to it to support them to learn as they implement and as they evolve their stakeholders to make sure that the outcomes, those health outcomes and the sustainability outcomes, are really being met. So both those projects are funded by Australian development aid policy and funds through different buckets, but we've got long-standing relationships with organisations in our region. Now, the benefits of partnerships, I'm sure you can imagine what they are, but I see them as really directly supporting those actors in the civic space who are building peace and security, developing those people-to-people connections, as I mentioned, which is fundamental to our relationship with our region, that deeper understanding of culture and forming trust and friendships, and supporting gender equality and inclusion in ways that are locally led and culturally informed, and overall supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you're very aware of. And of course, your goal is very much goal 16. My goal is very much goals 5 and 6. But as we know, all of these goals are required for peace and stability to be achieved. And also, we would say that goal 6, clean water and sanitation, underpin every goal as well. So thank you so much. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn and look forward to the chat after this. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melita. I can already see some questions and comments coming in the chat, so we'll get to those in the Q&A discussion. Don't worry. It was really great to hear about you highlighting the civil society actor involvement and how crucial that is to have success. And I think it was really nice to have also highlighted, I guess, some of the positive programs that already exist that are working towards promotion of a comprehensive peace and security that we can recognise and think about building upon more. And before we pick up that more in the Q&A discussion, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Emeritus Professor Ian Lowe, who'll be talking to the topic of water, nuclear power, and radioactive waste. So there are several reasons for us to be thinking about proposals to do with nuclear power in Australia, which Ian is going to sort of elaborate on. And Ian is an Emeritus Professor in the School of Environment and Science at Griffith University, a former Director of the Commission for the Future, President of the Australian Conservative Foundation between 2004 to 2014, author of many books and a co-chair of the APSF. So thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Melita. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gubbi people as the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I was delighted to see Melita introduce the Sustainable Development Goals because they should be first and foremost in our discussion of policy, but we hear almost nothing about them. And similarly, we hear almost nothing about Australia's National Strategy for Ecologically Sustainable Development, which COE adopted in 1992 and should be a framework for all decision-making. In terms of nuclear energy, Australia set up an Atomic Energy Commission in the 1950s and has established a research reactor at Lucas Heights, which was then bushland well outside Sydney, and tried to encourage each of the state electricity grids to consider building nuclear power stations. It turned out that the smallest nuclear power station that might have been economically credible was far too large for any of the state grids. So that never materialised, but the nuclear lobby persuaded the short-lived Gorton government to decide to establish a reactor on Commonwealth land at Jervis Bay on the New South Wales coast. They went as far as calling tenders, but by the time the tenders came in, Gorton had been replaced by Billy McMahon, and he was alarmed by the cost. He put the project on hold and the Whitlam government cancelled it completely. So there was no further talk about nuclear energy until John Howard became embarrassed by his inaction on climate change. He set up a review under Dr. Ziggy Switkowski, who was about as independent as an Alabama sheriff because he was head of the Nuclear Science and Technology Organization at the time. And they did a global trip looking at nuclear power, and they did their best to make a case for Australia building nuclear power stations, but you can only push the facts so far. And their report said that it would require both a carbon price and other forms of subsidy to make nuclear power look cost effective in Australia. And it would take at least 10 years and probably 15 to build one nuclear power station. The South Australian Royal Commission also said that nuclear power would not be cost effective in Australia. And we thought that it had been permanently buried at the crossroads with a silver stake through its heart until Mr. Dutton's announcement earlier this year. There's a fair amount of post-truth in the coalition's announcement that they would build 7 nuclear reactors at sites around all of the mainland states. They would be operating by 2035. They would provide cheap, clean, zero emissions baseload power, and that Australia was the only one of the G20 countries that wasn't either operating nuclear power stations or moving towards it. That, of course, is a lie, as is the claim that nuclear would provide cheap, clean, zero emissions baseload power. There are a range of obvious problems with the proposal to build nuclear power stations. It is illegal under Commonwealth law and under state laws in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. Nobody with any credibility in the industry believes we could build 1 reactor by 2035, let alone build 7. They could not be economic under any study that's been done. It's not clear the community wants nuclear power. The 2007 experience, when the Australia Institute drew up a short list of possible sites for a nuclear power station, created a tsunami of panic among sitting members of Parliament. And even Mr. Dutton's state colleague in Queensland, Mr. Chris Foley, was eager to tell Queenslanders before the state election that they would not accept nuclear power in Queensland. And the final point is one of effectiveness. If we did build 7 nuclear power stations, they would provide 5 or 6 gigawatts of electricity. Our current peak demand is more than 40 gigawatts. About 30 gigawatts of coal-fired electricity will close in the next 10 years. That would provide about 10% of our expected energy needs in 2035. Water is also a significant issue. The Academy of Technology and Engineering made a submission to the current parliamentary inquiry, pointing out that water is needed for steam generation, neutron moderation and plant cooling. So a nuclear power station needs 15% more water than a coal-fired power station. To quantify that, the recently built power stations in the United Arab Emirates use 100 tonnes a second of seawater. To put that in perspective, Melbourne Water provides about 15 or 20 tonnes of water per second to service the needs of a city of 5 million people. Another calculation is that the annual water demand for one reactor would be about 20 gigalitres, which is about the average annual runoff to the entire Murray-Darling Basin. It doesn't make economic sense, as the CSIRO and the energy market operator have pointed out, that wind and solar with storage to be firm capacity is far cheaper than nuclear or any fossil fuel industry with carbon capture and storage, if that could ever be made to work. The CSIRO said the inclusion of nuclear was only as a point of interest rather than a practicality. There's legitimate scepticism about whether the laws could or would be changed to allow nuclear power, whether the electors would vote for them, how much the program would cost, whether local communities would accept them, whether the waste could be managed responsibly, how our neighbours would react, all of which suggests that it's not really a serious proposal, simply a distraction to take attention away from the fact that the coalition is still really in denial about climate change and wants to keep burning fossil fuels. And Moya suggests that this is Mr. Dutton flogging his nuclear dead horse. The AUKUS program adds a new dimension to the nuclear problem. You might remember that there was a debate in the defence industry about how their new submarine should be powered. The Turnbull government did a deal with France to repurpose their nuclear submarines to run on conventional power, but Mr. Morrison did secret negotiations with the UK and the US and lied to France, as the French president memorably pointed out, for a deal under which we would get pre-loved boats from the United States and then new builds from the United Kingdom, altogether an eye-watering budget and dubious efficacy for defence, as Professor Hugh White has pointed out. And if you're interested, there is a forensic analysis of the whole proposal in Andrew Fowler's book, Nuked. This is what Moya thinks of the white elephant of the AUKUS submarines if they were ever delivered by the time warfare would have significantly altered in the 2050s. The reason I raise that is that we already have an issue with radioactive waste. It's an inevitable consequence of nuclear science and technology that it produces radioactive waste. We have in storage about 5,000 cubic metres of low-level waste and produce an extra 40 cubic metres every year. The Commonwealth government has made 3 unsuccessful attempts to establish a national storage for low-level radioactive waste, and the only place where it can legally be stored at the moment is a toxic waste dump in Western Australia, which has been given permission to store low-level radioactive waste locally. The spent fuel rods from the research reactor at Lucas Heights, when reprocessed, leave us with intermediate level waste, and we have about 650 cubic metres of that in temporary storage at Lucas Heights. There is no permanent solution for this waste, for which near-surface storage is unacceptable. It requires deep underground storage, and there is no long-term plan for that. Nuclear power stations, if they were built, would provide much more intractable waste that requires permanent isolation for geological time. The UK and the US have tried to decide and defend a site for high-level radioactive waste without success. Finland is the only country that's moving towards an acceptable solution for high-level waste, And the obvious question is, if we built high-level waste, how would we ensure that it doesn't contaminate groundwater? Nuclear submarines would add another dimension to the problem because they have small reactors sealed for the life of the boat, which uses highly enriched uranium, weapons-grade material, and consequently produces a much nastier mix of waste products, which nobody knows how to deal with. The UK and the US have been operating nuclear submarines for more than 50 years and are simply stockpiling the used reactors, trying to figure out how to deal with them. But in the fine print of the AUKUS agreement, we have agreed to take responsibility for managing the waste from those if they were ever built. This is what Moya thinks will probably be the coalition's approach, coal-powered submarines, given that nuclear submarines raise a whole set of problems. Climate change demands decarbonising our energy supply, and globally there is a massive shift to renewables. Nuclear energy is not a rational response, partly because of its demands on water, but because of a whole series of other problems, not least of which is the fact that it would produce radioactive waste, which we simply have no plan for dealing with. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Ian, for providing a really good outline of some of the real water and other really environmental impacts related to nuclear power and technologies. I'm going to jump straight into the Q&A and stay with you, Ian, because there's a question around addressing, if you can, the routine, inevitable and unavoidable risks also to workers and public from ionizing radiation as a result of operating nuclear power stations, and mentioning results from Europe, UK and US that show greater risks than reflected in current radiation protection standards.
Well, if a nuclear power station is operated safely and there are no accidents, the level of radiation affecting surrounding communities should be acceptable, although there's some wonderful examples of the nuclear authorities basically cooking the books to suggest that the level of radiation is acceptable. When the head of the British Atomic Energy Agency was asked why they were establishing the prototype fast breeder reactor at Dounreay in the far north of Scotland, he said it was because they wanted to make sure that that the reactor wouldn't irradiate communities. And they did some calculations assuming that the containment would absorb 99% of the radiation. And they found to their alarm that that meant that the radiation levels for the surrounding community were unacceptable. And Lord Hinton said, this was easily put right. We had assumed 99% containment, and this showed that the site was unacceptable. So we simply assumed more realistically 99.9% containment. And by doing this, we established that the site was perfect. Basically, they cooked the books, moved the decimal point one place, and established that the radiation levels were acceptable. In normal operation, things should be okay, but the problem is that accidents happen. And whether it's 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl or Fukushima, accidents have made uninhabitable whole regions. And for that reason, I've always thought that nuclear power should be the last shot in the locker. We should only use it if we are really desperate, because if things go wrong, the consequences are far worse than if things go wrong with any other technology for producing energy.
Great, thank you. And there's a few comments of appreciation of your account of the kind of nuclear energy question in Australia generally as well that I just wanted to point out. And then a different question is in relation to the civil society space and the role of trade unions in this. So perhaps Melita, if you could.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's an omission, sorry. They are certainly in the civil society, civic space. Trade unions play a very important role. And I'm sure you know the organisation AFIDA very well, and the role that they have played in these sorts of partnerships with their similar sort of organisations internationally, and that allyship and advocacy that they do together. Very important work. So yes, I'm going to add trade unions to my diagram of examples of civil society organizations. Thanks for that.
I don't see any other questions at this moment in the chat, so feel free to put them there if anyone's holding on to any thoughts. But in the meantime, I just wanted to ask all of our speakers this evening that if you could pick one particular different key approach to managing an aspect of water in Australia, or one particular policy that you would think would have a big impact quite soon, what would you think is important to prioritise?
If I can jump in first, referring to what Quentin said, the very first national report on the state of the environment nearly 30 years ago said that the health of our inland rivers, particularly the Murray-Darling system, is a serious problem. And since then, we haven't scaled back diversion, and much of the water diverged is used incredibly inefficiently. I went past Burke a couple of years ago, and the water is flowing through shallow open channels in the arid region. So probably more water evaporates than actually gets to the farms. And when the water gets to the farms, again, it's flowing through shallow open channels. In South Australia, they moved to drip irrigation a couple of decades ago, which uses water much more efficiently. But much of the water taken out of the Murray-Darling system is still used with embarrassing inefficiency.
Yes, I agree, Ian, and thank you for the question, Russell, as well. Why does water get overlooked in policy making in Australia, and what can we do about it? My response was going to somewhat answer that as well, and it comes down to political prioritization, doesn't it? Water doesn't have a voice, and our ministries reflect the way in which we've compartmentalized water in quite weird ways. So it makes coordinating very hard. Yes, the transboundary nature in Australia also throws in some political challenges, that's for sure. But yeah, if politicians, if governments decided to value water and make it an important factor in our lives, and prioritize and have a minister for water and have departments that all, that are resourced to give water that voice, then it would actually, it wouldn't be overlooked quite as much. So pretty much all of the answers to what can we do better come down to governance, because as Ian talked about in terms of the technologies might be there, but the risks of using certain technologies or the sustainability of certain technologies, that's very questionable, but the governance of them is what's key, which is what Quentin also drew out very, very articulately in his, I love the use of your Ds as well.
And Quentin, actually, there's a response for you, a question for you rather, about elaborating a bit more on dispossession of First Nation people and whether this is being addressed in the water space.
Well, it's not. There's micro steps in the right direction in the context that there was a commitment made in 2018 to get through the Northern Basin changes, which was to increase the level of diversions in the Northern Basin of the Murray-Darling Basin. And part of the deal that was bipartisan with Labor and Coalition was government at the time, was that there would be funds, around $40 million to provide for an increase in water holdings, water entitlements by Indigenous peoples in the Murray-Darling Basin. That's been subsequently increased with the current Labor government up to $100 million. It hasn't formally happened yet, although I've been told that it's about to happen, but it hasn't formally happened. But even if it were, were to happen, which I expect it will before the election, so that, but it's a tiny, tiny fraction of what's required. So we're talking here that the value of water entitlements in the Murray-Darling Basin, a minimum of $26,000 million worth of water entitlements And we're allocating 100 million to overcome the disadvantage and inequity in terms of water holdings. So that's a drop in the bucket, as they say, but at least it's a step in the right direction if it happens, and hopefully it will be announced before the next federal election. But it's worth highlighting the dispossession. I mean, that dispossession started in 1788 when the first fleet arrived in Sydney. So we had this, what was called the streamlet, became known as the tank stream. That was obviously taken and appropriated from the traditional custodians, Gadigal people, and that has continued ever since in some form or other until First Peoples in this country have virtually no water entitlements. And it's continuing today in the sense that when I tell people this, they sort of look at me aghast. This can't be true. This is Australia. We're a democracy. How could this possibly? Well, it is happening in 2024. Okay, the Northern Territory government has made decisions, and actually in the previous year as well, to increase the water, groundwater used, and in one case, in the Georgina Weiser water allocation plan, by about 1,000%. That's a huge increase in terms of the extractions in that water allocation plan, and to double the water allocations in the Mataranka water allocation plan. And Mataranka, by the way, is 4.5 hours drive south of Darwin. It has those fabulous springs, Mataranka Springs, Rainbow Springs, Sacred Sites, Bitter Springs. Those places are world-class. Water quality is absolutely pristine, and it is already being damaged. Four Corners program came out a couple of months ago looking at that. So that's what's happening. It's happening on land that's owned under native title, owned by First Peoples. They object to what's happening. They have participated in process to stop that happening, yet it is still happening. And the people getting the water licenses, again, you'll aghast, how could this be true? Well, it is. They're getting it for free. They don't even have to pay for the water license. And if you get one of these groundwater licenses, they're worth multiple millions of dollars. Okay, multiple millions of dollars. So that's the state of affairs in 2024. And the big losers in that, everyone's a loser, except for those getting the water licenses. Of course, the First Peoples in the Northern Territory. But we're all losers because the environment is getting damaged and degraded by too much extraction and, of course, water quality losses. So that's a brief summary to that question about what's happening. It's not good news. We need to be part of a dialogue process, as in everybody, including First Peoples and ourselves in this forum, to make sure that people know about what's going on and that those decisions get made with everybody around the table, not just the few people who happen to make political donations to the right people at the right time.
Yeah, thank you, Quentin. I think, as you've highlighted, there's a clear failure here, and it's something that really needs to be pointed out and people need to be made aware of, because there's still that factor that people don't know that it's going on in the public, etc. And that these discussions can be a really good place to start dialoguing about that amongst ourselves, and then where we take that further. I will ask another question. We've still got a bit of time that's in the chat. So directed to Ian, as to why you think the Labor Party is not emphasising problems with sufficient access to water for a nuclear power station to be managed, and what do you think they are hoping to achieve with the public inquiries being held around the country?
I suppose they hope that the public inquiries will reveal that the coalition's plan for nuclear power stations is just not credible. It doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make technical sense. No one in the electricity industry thinks it makes sense. And I think that they hope that the coalition has rendered itself largely unelectable, or certainly made its task of getting elected much more difficult by embracing the idea of nuclear power. And just questions like where the water would come from or how much money it would cost have not been answered by the coalition, and it's probably because they don't have answers for where they would obtain the water, and they don't really seem to have any idea what it would cost to build 7 nuclear power stations. Just one final comment about the economics. The only places where nuclear power has ever seemed economically viable are countries where there are huge cross subsidies from the weapons industry, and countries like Australia where there is no opportunity of cross subsidies for the weapons industry. The figures given by the industry for the cost of building a nuclear power station just don't have any credibility, because the only nuclear power stations built in Western Europe or North America this century have all been years behind schedule and squillions over budget. Just to give one example, Hinkley Point in the UK, when they started building, they said it would be cooking Christmas dinners by 2017, and it would cost about 10 or 15 billion Australian dollars. They're now saying 2029, perhaps, maybe 2030, maybe 2031, and it costs more like 100 billion Australian dollars for one power station. So it just doesn't add up. And the more questions are asked of the coalition, the more difficulty they will have explaining this policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ian. I want to squeeze in one or two more questions that we have from the chat. So one is if Melita could tell us a bit more about which countries Australia has water aid projects with in our region. Is it only Indonesia and Cambodia, or are there others?
Yes, thank you for the question. We're working a lot in the region in many countries. As when I say we, I mean Australian organisations who have a focus on water and sanitation, both in terms of the NGOs delivering programs and also research organisations like ours. And one particular fund that again is DFAT funded, called Water for Women, has projects all over the region, from Nepal, Bhutan, through to Cambodia, and then all over the Pacific and Timor-Leste. And so I've been very lucky that over the last 7 years have been part of this big, like a community of practice, but we've all got different projects being funded by Water for Women. I'm going to put the link in the chat now. And they're all over the region and in different ways. But the big focus of the projects under that fund were gender equality and inclusion and climate resilience, with a focus on water and sanitation. So lots and lots of great examples. That's internationally, that's some of the best work that is being done in the water and sanitation space because of that partnership and that real genuine collaboration that happened under that fund. It's just finishing up in December. So yeah, that's a good resource there. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. And speaking of finishing up in December, that's a good segue into something I want to quickly comment on. I'll wrap up our discussion on water in a second, but this is our last webinar of the year for APSF. But looking forward to next year, it would be really great to get your feedback as the audience and people engaging with us on topics that you think might be valuable for us to do other webinars on or do further research on. So in terms of thinking about comprehensive peace and security for Australia, if there's any particular things you think are particularly important or pressing, please also leave that in the chat, because that's really great for us to know and think about when we're planning forward to next year. So I invite you to do that anytime now until the end of the webinar, if anything comes to mind. But I guess to finish up on today's topic of water and how it is essential to life and security, I really want to thank our speakers, Quentin, Melita, and Ian, for your perspectives and your talks earlier and the discussion that we've just had. I think it's a really sort of difficult topic to broach in terms of being a little bit enfranchised or disheartened by some of the state of the realities, the myths that Quentin has pointed out that we're contending with in Australia, these proposals to do with nuclear energy that obviously have a lot of problems, but at the same time there are areas where we see positive initiatives happening, where we can look to think about how positive action can be taken by civil society, how we can push government on the issue of water. Obviously, it is essential for our security, for our livelihoods, and it is, I think, a really nice topic to have covered early in terms of thinking about a comprehensive peace and security. Obviously, there's like lots of other issues that might come to mind, but highlighting something like water for Australian peace and security was, I think, a really important step in terms of showing the way that we're thinking about having dialogues to do with working towards comprehensive peace and security in Australia. So thank you very much again to our speakers and to everyone in the audience for joining us for the webinar this evening. And we hope you can stay in touch with us. So follow us on our social media and look out for updates from us in the new year. But otherwise, I wish everyone really well for the rest of the year. And thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Matilda.